Indian Standard Time, we are going to have a panel discussion on COVID-19 in South Asia, perspectives on migrant labor, society, and state. And this is part of the 5th annual workshop on migration and forced migration being organized by the Calcutta Research Group in collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Berlin and IWM, that is Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna. We know that since March 2020, COVID-19 virus has infected almost 10 million people in South Asia so far. When the pandemic has been spreading all over South Asia, the migrants worker in particular, and more so, for the informal labor, were mired in a survival crisis through loss of income, hunger, destitution, and threat from state authorities, policing, containment, and also they had to confront the fearful communities maintaining social distance. In this context, we hope that today's panel would analyze how the COVID-19 pandemic experiences of lockdown migrant workers have been accentuating poverty, informality, and inequality. We also hope that this panel would examine how effective the existing post-colonial social policies have been to protect this vulnerable group in neoliberal times and mitigate dislocation, discrimination, and destitution at this moment and in future. We all are aware of images of hundreds of thousands of migrant workers in India trudging for miles and miles on highways that flooded the newspapers and television screens for days, and luggage perched on their heads, babies in arms, and elderly struggling alongside. The migrants were fleeing en masse to their native villages. This tragic exodus was triggered by the sudden lockdown imposed to curb the spread of COVID-19, and the journey in India has been fatal for some. As one migrant worker said, I quote, "If coronavirus doesn't kill us, hunger will." As the humanitarian crisis unfolded, we know that in South Asia, and also in India, particularly in India, the provincial or the state government started scrambling, often in partnership, in collaboration with local communities, to provide rations and shelter for the now suddenly visible migrants. But was all this too little, too late? Why were not night shelters, community kitchens, public toilets, and free food could be mobilized for this huge mass of migrant workers before the lockdown was announced? Now, Calcutta Research Group has already published 2 ebooks edited by its distinguished chair on migration and forced migration, Professor Ranabir Samaddar, entitled Borders of an Epidemic, COVID-19 at the Migrant Workers, and Burdens of an Epidemic, a Policy Perspective on COVID-19 and Migrant Workers. Today, we have a very distinguished panel of 5 speakers representing different countries of South Asia, and who would be reflecting on today's theme to have in the long run a comparative perspective on the South Asian situations. I shall introduce them when they speak one by one. But before I do that, let me request all the speakers to restrict their initial comments within 8 to 10 minutes so that we can have, rotate the panelists and have interventions from the participants of the workshop, as well as from other parts of the world who have joined us. Let me therefore alerting each panelist after 7 minutes in the initial round so that she or he can conclude her or his comments. Having said that, let me begin with Professor Meghna Guha-Thakurta, who will be speaking first. Dr. Meghna Guha-Thakurta is the Executive Director, Research Initiatives, Bangladesh, and she has been closely associated with the Calcutta Research Group over the last 2 decades. A PhD from the University of York, UK, she was Professor of International Relations at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, till 2007. Her areas of interest include development, gender, and politics in South Asia. She was a member of Netherlands Development Research Council and also chaired the subcommittee on post-conflict development in that council. She has published extensively in many reputed journals, apart from being in the editorial board of a few. I also had the opportunity to co-edit a book with her entitled Living on the Edge, Essays on the Chittagong Hill Tracts, long back in 1997. So it's over to Professor Meghna Guha-Thakurta.
Thank you, Shambhushachi, for the very generous introduction. Thank you all for attending, those participants. Since a few days ago or a month ago, I think I presented a similar kind of paper to CRG. But this one, therefore, I don't want to repeat that. It was more like a description of what happened to the migrant labor situation in Bangladesh during COVID time. So rather than a descriptive kind of presentation, and since I only have 7 to 8 minutes, I will hone on in one particular. I'll anchor my presentation on the rural-urban linkage, which is actually a much more structural feature of the fault lines that we've talked about in the introduction, rather than just a descriptive functional way of looking at migrant labor. So there will be 3 kinds of migrant labor that I will be looking at. One is the international migrant labor, which is very important to Bangladesh because it is the highest foreign exchange earner through remittances, and some of them were forced to return during COVID time, mostly from the Gulf states. The second is the RMG workers, the ready-made garments factory workers. Most of them, 83% of them whom are female, and they are also migrating from rural areas. So that too is they are also migrant labor. And the third is the agricultural wage labor who face impact and consequences of migration. Maybe they are not migrant labor as such, but in a way the consequence of migration is still there. And they are also partial migrations because part of their family may have migrated to cities while the other part are there in agricultural wage labor. I will then look at a little bit about the prospects of reverse migration, which we are seeing back from the city to the rural areas as a result of COVID, and the prospects of, and also concluding analysis, I can say. So international migrant labor, I've explained, is drawn mostly from agricultural wage labor. The forced return is not only jeopardizing the economy through dropping the remittances, but also prospects of adding to high rate of employment. In Bangladesh, 70% of population are young people under 30 years of age. That's projected that it will be a very young Bangladesh. Already there is a high rate of unemployment being projected for these people. And with the 7th five-year plan had said, basically, if you read it, that there is no jobs available. One has to go more towards self-employment. So it's a critical factor if the added amount of there is a drop in remittance and the added labor is back, is returned and is coming back to Bangladesh to add to that unemployment. In the ready-made garments factory, mostly the female labor, it's also the second largest foreign exchange earner. And they, interestingly, come from rural areas, not from the production sector. Unlike the wage laborers going to the international market, the women are from the social reproduction sector, you could say. And so there is and part of their earnings through many studies that have been reported, the siphons back to their tertiary sectors, for example, educating their younger siblings or accumulating small capital to buy for farm capital, small farm capital to buy land or to create orchards, etc. So this is an interesting phenomena which the rural urban linkage, which I will throw light on the rural-urban linkage I will be talking about. Thirdly, the agricultural labor is also undergoing some changes. You know that there is an increasing feminization of agricultural labor because the men are taking into already in the overall structure of the agrarian system in Bangladesh, the agrarian households are lessening their dependence on purely agriculture and taking up small petty trading or special skills such as carpentry, etc. So already there is feminization of agricultural wage labor, which was not there before. There were cultural barriers in areas, there still are, but in many areas that has been, it's coming up. And it has strong linkages with the urban sector because many of the men may be working in the tertiary sector like transport, rickshaw pulling, vendors, etc., in the cities, while the women plows the field or works in the field. So this is a new phenomena. Also, another upcoming phenomena gradually, getting quite visible in the countryside is the existing of decentralized EPZs, which are not only garments oriented, but a lot of like, producing wigs for export. So these are also part of the scenario of the current rural scene in Bangladesh, where women are being again recruited into these factories. And many of the standard division of labors that we are used to, the stereotypes, are breaking down. Not very, sometimes with obstacles, with impediments, but are undergoing change. So what are the prospects of these reverse migration? We know that it's projected that in the first months or so, 25,000 jobs would have been lost in the RNG factory. If that is so, then the projected rate is about 500,000. Many companies have withdrawn their orders, are not replacing them, although a lot of work is being going on the part of the state and the private sector, but still so a lot of reverse migration is revealing the fault lines of the rural-urban linkage. When we say migrant, we actually mean the rural-urban linkages of labor. And this has not been addressed either by state policies or by the left movement, who are working with the struggle of the workers. So this is something that is needs to be taken into consideration. So there are debates about what's going to happen or what is the trend about the impact of the pandemic. And of course, the debates are that is the reverse migration going to be a permanent feature, or is it just a temporary? Many people believe it's just a temporary thing, but nothing is predictable. Now that the second spike is coming up and the industries do not show signs of immediate recovery in the coming few years, maybe there will be a kind of reverse migration. And the decentralization of these industries, is it enough to compensate the loss of the first two labor markets, which is the international labor market and the city-based RMG factory labor market? And again, another question comes in is how far can these new liberal policies already in action and in place by the state from the 90s onwards in Bangladesh, how can it be upturned or changed given the nature of the regime and the capital it is nurturing? To explain a little bit about this is that, for example, I mentioned just suggestions like, yes, more employment for youth, or opportunities for youth employment, more decentralization of EPZs are just the tip of the iceberg. The rural-urban fault line that it treads on is basically about the accumulation of capital, that this new kind of economy that is growing is actually being based on eviction of many vulnerable people from their land. We've been hearing of five-star hotels coming up in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Marma, Mru-owned common land. And similar stories are all over the place, from the microscopic to the macroscopic and the regional. So it has, so a big question is, how can you actually tend to the welfare of a labor market, or the of migrant labor? Just, is it in this neoliberal system, which has no space for welfare, how can it be upturned? So far, neither the state nor the labor struggles in Bangladesh have any concrete answer for that. And I think it is something that is a matter for future research. I'll end here and we can take up more in the question answer section.
Thank you very much, Professor Go Thakurta. Our next panelist is Reza Hussaini, who is a research fellow at the Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organization. And he has more than 10 years experiences working with research and higher education institutions in Kabul, Afghanistan. His research areas include gender, peace processes, human rights, and migration. And he was also research manager at the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, where he collaborated with City University of London on a study of migration decision and policy making in Afghanistan. Currently, he is also a member of the South Asia Network on Development and Displacement. Mr. Reza Hussaini.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen if it's okay for a very small presentation. Please let me know if you see the screen.
We see it. We see it.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I just want to give some sort of background, which is the COVID happening in Afghanistan. So then I will move quickly to the impact of COVID and migrants workers and IDPs, or internally displaced people in Afghanistan. And finally, the government response to these situations. Okay. The context of Afghanistan is a bit different compared to the other South Asian country in terms of the conflict and war. So Afghans in everyday life actually face risk of being attacked and killed while they are in education center, university, mosque, or even in the hospital. So dealing with the risk of everyday life might make it different to deal with the COVID risk also. COVID came to Afghanistan in a situation that Afghanistan is suffering from the 40 years of ongoing war and conflict. And there many people are in need of basics and face extreme poverty. And from the other side, there is no proper infrastructure, especially at the public health. At the meantime, right now, a peace negotiation is running in Doha between the Taliban and the Afghan government. These peace negotiations led to intensifying war since the Taliban wants to show its power at the battleground in order to gain more at the negotiation table. So consequences of this heated war is increased number of IDPs in Afghanistan. For example, due to war at the south of Afghanistan, we have 54,000 people displaced on September only. And the total number of IDPs reached right now more than 4 million till the end of 2019. So from the other side, it's interesting that the total number of infected to COVID up to now is like 43,000, and the number of deaths is like 1,600 based on the figures from the Public Health Ministry. But many believe that figures are not correct or reliable, even the Ministry of Public itself, because This low number is maybe because there is a low number due to the very low capacity of the health system to test COVID-19. So many cases may not identified actually. The second slide, which I'm going to talk about, is about the impact of COVID on migrant labor. You know, it's the first positive case of coronavirus were recorded in the western city of Herat in February 2020, following the explosion in the number of infection in neighboring country of Iran. After pandemic spread rapidly in Iran, many Afghan migrants workers lost their job, and then the Iranian economy was already weak due to the escalating tension with the US, and the pandemic made it worse. So this had a huge and rapid impact on Afghan daily workers in Iran. Most workers returned from Iran, traveled back through Herat, and it's believed that the COVID-19 is spread out from Herat provinces, and there were no control or checks on the border until very late. And there were no measures to control the movement of infected people to control the spread of the virus. As a result, many people blamed returnees for bringing the COVID with them and causing the pandemic in Herat and then all over Afghanistan. Then the process of stigmatization start, and many people or infected with the COVID let many hide their infection and made the situations even worse. And most of the returnees were undocumented migrants in Iran, and they were out of system and not eligible to receive any sort of medical facilities, and like they are not exist at all. So they have no choice except to return to Afghanistan. Here, I want to talk also a bit about the coping strategies inside Afghanistan, mostly the IDPs and the poor urban. In such a poverty, there was huge impact, especially on children. I see myself that number of children and women begging increased suddenly after the lockdown, especially among IDPs, internally displaced people. They can be searching among ways for food and collecting recycled waste to sell. So they try to cope with the current situation, and there was some number of strategies. For example, many poor families were forced to change their diets to cheapest possible food instead of normal or healthy food. After the lockdown in Kabul, some of the urban IDPs living on the outskirts of the Kabul city start to return to their villages, exactly like what happens in Bangladesh. Since they had lost their jobs and the school was shut down, and the villages seems far from COVID-19, and life is much cheaper since they don't need to pay for rent or electricity or else. However, this contributes to the spread of virus, actually. The other strategy is that some of the family postponed the treatment of diseases of a family member to save a bit more money for upcoming uncertain situations. But the other strategy, or the coping strategy, is the remigration. Although many daily workers in both Iran and Afghanistan lost their job and were forced to return home, but they could not survive very long. And within a short period of time, people start trying to return to Iran in hope of finding work, even with very low wages, even though during the quarantine, the border was shut and the petrol were increased. People are trying to cross the border to Iran because they have no other choice. And the response of the Iranian government, they just increased the petrol, and for example, and the reaction was really brutal. In one case, during the pandemic, 50 Afghan migrants were caught crossing the border and thrown into river by Iranian border guard. 12 died, and bodies of the further 5 were never found. So the other things that I want to add here is that the COVID, it's like a crisis, a livelihood crisis, rather than the health emergency here in Afghanistan. the impact of COVID has been more in terms of poverty and livelihood crisis rather than the health emergency. Few Afghans actually could offer to stop working even as infection rate increases. Spokesman for the World Food Program in Afghanistan said that 44% of all Afghans rely on unsustainable livelihood that will be disturbed by the shock due to the outbreak of the COVID-19. In cities, the lockdown reduced economic activities and left the most vulnerable family, including the urban poor, communities of the IDPs, and all those relying on casual labor for survival, not knowing where their next meal will come from. Even according to the WFP, the poverty rate is expected to surge to 22% point. Here, at the last slide, I just want to explain what the COVID situations revealed about the Afghan society and what was the Afghan government response. In terms of the society, it is very clear the more pressure was on most vulnerable people, especially migrants, labor, and IDP. And the COVID just exacerbated pre-existing inequalities in Afghanistan. I have talked with many of them. And they are actually nowadays, they are not worried about the COVID itself, but the consequences like the lockdown and not support and losing the job. They suffer from lack of access to basic needs. So COVID itself actually is not an issue anymore. And the other point is that the capacity of the society to respond positively is very limited. And because the people are under significant strain, so solidarity is limited. Although there were a lot of help from the outside Afghanistan, especially from the Afghan diaspora. My last point here about the state response to COVID. You know that the Afghanistan, as I said, involved in a very long war. So the priority in such a country is war. It has been for more than 40 years. And you know, the war economy is the most important priority for the government. And then not able to protect the citizen, especially if there is a crisis like the COVID. And during the lockdown, actually the lockdown is not really any special plan from or announcement from the government, just it suddenly happened. And the government doesn't have any plan to support the vulnerable group. And there was only a short-term project to provide bread for poor family, which due to corruption, it was failed. So people actually lost all trust in the government. And there's no policy to support the migrants or IDPs. And if there is some policies, it's actually influenced by the powerful government, like the EU countries, which influence on the IDP and the migrants policy, which is actually sort of preventing them to migrate. So but as a last word, I can say that with all these conditions, it's very likely the new wave of migration happened from Afghanistan to the other countries as a survival strategy. Although it seems that I can say the more resilience to the COVID is relatively high, but economic and security situation is getting worse and worse. As we saw, even with closed border and lockdown, migration doesn't stop. So people move either back to villages or to other countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reza. And we have just listened to Meghna and Reza, I mean, giving us two different kinds of pictures, which are very similar and in a way dissimilar also. In the sense in Bangladesh, I mean, the question of migrants is slightly different in the sense that it is a country which was really growing, I mean, so far as its economy is concerned over the years, due to the expansion of the garment industry and the big multinationals outsourcing their production system and supply chain to some countries like Bangladesh. And also, I mean, what Meghna pointed out correctly, that about 83% of the workers in the garment industry, they have been women, and what kind of situation they have been facing when some of the orders or bulk of the orders from these multinational companies or corporations, they were cancelled. and the kind of problems that also had in the Bangladesh society due to the lack of, preparedness on behalf of the state in Bangladesh. And also, I mean, how even the left movement, it was not really prepared to deal with such a situation, how to ensure the rights of the migrant labor. And a similar situation in Afghanistan, we listened to from Reza, in the sense that it is a war-torn country and it is one of the poorest countries in South Asia. And having faced, the warlike situation for the last many years, and where already many people were displaced, including the internally displaced persons. And when people are returning from Iran or Pakistan, I mean, one element is the stigmatization of these migrant labor. And most importantly, what Reza has indicated, that COVID-19 pandemic has turned into a livelihood crisis, not only in Afghanistan, I would say that all over South Asia. So having listened to all these two kind of experiences from Reza and earlier from Meghna, let us now move on to Mr. Jivan Tyagaraja. Jivan is the Executive Director of the Consortium of Humanitarian Affairs, Colombo, Sri Lanka. He has been promoting multiculturalism, designing public policies, and defining advisory services for policies around human security for minorities and marginalized groups, durable solutions for the end of displacement, and countering root causes of violent extremism. As a specialist in countering climate-induced disasters, he has been coordinating agencies in delivering assistance, seeking compliance with standards and international best practices, convening observers and observing elections also. He is also a regular columnist in news dailies, and he has been quite close to Calcutta Research Group once again for many, many years. And we have worked together on many issues, particularly with regard to the Minority Rights Charter in South Asia long back. So it's over to Jiban.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you. Thank you so much, Savyasti. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. Bear with me, I'm working off my phone, so bear with me if there are any technical issues. So just getting straight into the topic that's given to us, I'm just looking at broadly the commonalities. Clearly, migrant labor is a common phenomenon in the subcontinent. And with utmost respect to Pakistan, where my knowledge is somewhat limited, I got the impression that decades back, there were a lot of migrant labor coming from the frontier into Sindh. I'm talking in terms of internal migration. So, but broadly speaking, I think migrant labor is a common phenomenon, listening to both the narrative from Bangladesh as well as Afghanistan. Another commonality, which I suspect is very true, is that from beginning of this year, the virus has thrown into very sharp focus existing fragilities and inequalities in poorer communities, particularly those displaced. And I presume one could attach a broad meaning to displacement to include people working away from home in other settings, particularly urban settings. And I think, regrettably, COVID gave a whole new meaning to displacement to those people. And clearly, people working from home, be it internal to their country or external by way of migration, do so as a coping strategy, which also emphasizes the economic condition. And of course, again, what is common is that pandemic forced many to return home or were stranded, and the plight of those stranded is unspeakable, to say the least. People left to earn, and we now have situations where the families have to send money for them to live in those countries, which is just, something else, to say the least. They really have to sell off, pawn, and God only knows how, keep those people alive in those migrant countries until they come home. What is worse is that to come home, you're coming home to your own country, you pay twice, 3 times more than what you would normally pay in terms of an airfare just to get back home. And I think that's a real outrage, to say the least. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And I'm not sure whether that's a common experience in some of the other countries in the conversation this afternoon. Looking at migrant labor, and that includes both internal as external, just by way of statistics, Sri Lanka has about 21 plus million people. And as of last year, about 8.2 were at work. So they're in the workforce. And just breaking it down, 2.2 in agriculture, 2.2 in industry, and 3.8 in services. And out of the 8.2, about 3 million receive a monthly wage. 2.6 get remunerated in terms of their success, in terms of self-employment, be it farming or anything else. 1.7 are daily wage workers, like laborers, etc. And these people would have, well, all of them were hit. The daily wage earners were hit harder. And there are others who also do not get paid because they're in the farming sector, etc. Now, I also go back now to another category, and that's the worker who's the workforce consisting of daily wage earners. 24% of all those who are employed are daily wage earners, and the bulk come to the Western province, with the lowest in another province. Now, the Western province was hard hit, and we were locked down for about 3 months previously, and we've got pockets of lockdown right now as we speak, also within the same province. Looking at external migration, female labor led the way up largely at the beginning. The males caught up, mostly unskilled, low educated, to get opportunities into the labor market. Both married and single went, and they became the breadwinners. Now, the reverse of that is that when you return, the consequence and the impact of that. I mentioned the fact that the virus created a whole new level of poverty and hunger. And I don't need to talk about the lockdowns and whatnot. And I think the chair spoke about the visuals of the lockdown within hours in the subcontinent and the tragedies that accompanied those who were affected. I mean, great tragedies to say the least. The loss of remittance, obviously, the country relied on it, and I think it was mentioned that Bangladesh, it was the top earner, very similar in Sri Lanka as well, and we are affected, no doubt about it. It's affecting not just in terms of internal remittances, but also in terms of, let's say, in the garment industry, what we export, and that's been, well, our exports are continuing, but tragically in our second wave, which began about a month back, it started within the garment sector. So there are a whole bunch of issues which those poor girls are now facing. Again, just by way of statistics, across the board in the country, about 8.7 of the households rely on remittances from overseas. Now, in terms of the remittances, the dependency spreads to outside of urban settings. So the impact of the loss of remittance will be also felt outside of the urban settings, outside of the hotspots. The story is not over because the repatriation process is still alive, and there are approximately 70,000 awaiting to come back home. Every flight that came back had somebody infected. So it multiplies some of the challenges once they're home, as well as it also shows the challenges they're already facing before they come. There was another tragic aspect, which I think is a common factor shared in some of our other countries. These hardworking people, and I was trying to make a note saying, when you talk about workers, it doesn't denote the person going in a hybrid car or a BMW or some other sedan. The worker is more the middle and lower. And there's a great fear of this particular worker, interestingly. can he be infected, etc. And it means that wherever they are staying or living, they're suspect. If they get marooned by way of quarantine, they're done because they're away from families. If they're quarantined, there is also impact in terms of wages to the families. So they really have extraordinary problems. And if you've got a tag attached to you, a stigma, like if you're a government worker, that's even worse because you will not get cheap accommodation. And when you go back home, you're suspected as being carrying infections back home. So stigmatization is a huge issue. In terms of the role of the state, Sabyashi, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the role of the state, there were two types of roles. Let me begin with the statutory authorities taking care of the migrant workers overseas. There were supposed to be, development officers offshore attached to our missions who were meant to take care of them, as well as an insurance fund to which all of them contributed, which is an insurance fund. Now, I really like to see that fund at work. So I'm not sure, I'm subject to correction. I haven't heard though. Internally, within the country, in terms of the role of state, clearly, in times of dire need and emergencies, the provision of essential services is something that the state takes over. Health services, mobility and access. Mobility and access has been sharply restricted, if not reduced, if not non-existent, due to lockdowns and curfews. The state has come forward with a distress allowance, and that's out there. Then the question of the role of the state, if any, in terms of return to jobs and the job market, as well as the skills that the migrant workers bring back home or the upgrading of the skills which the migrant workers may need to reintegrate here. I now move to probably the last section in terms of what we've been asked to speak about. Now, C19 or COVID-19 is a health issue, it's a medical issue. So no doubt about it, we need to have that center in terms of how can we put curbs to the spread of the disease, which with minimal disruption to the labor market as well as population mobility. Now that's a tall order, a tough task, but without which the impact is very, very high. Many of the labor that we talk about are in temporary, informal, or unprotected work, which means they are particularly vulnerable to job loss and wage reductions during this period. They also tend to live and work in rather crowded settings now, with no malice, because I'm extremely fond of this particular country. Singapore was an extraordinary example where they had it under control. There was a model country, and it exploded in boardings where migrant workers are residing. Then many of these people, in terms of their documentation, and because they're in the informal sector or what they call the gray economy, they have less than 100% documentation. So they have difficulties around that. Conversely, it also means that healthcare, personal protective equipment, sick pay, unemployment, social benefits may or may not be, quite frankly, applicable to all of them, with, again, difficult consequences. Looking at even linguistically and culturally appropriate health information, and if you could even talk rights and infection prevention regulations during this period, those are all challenges for these people. In terms of community, national, and regional and multi-sectoral coordination, I would say that we should have migrant workers or workers labor market in the COVID response and recovery as a special category. We should provide for prevention of stigmatization and discrimination, prevention, promoting culturally and linguistically appropriate messaging. We need to look at the occupational safety. We need to look at the education of migrant workers. We should look at the data in terms of to better understand the impact on them. We need to look at training of healthcare workers or frontline workers to be sensitive to migrant labor. Again, it's not meant to be difficult, but it is difficult realistically to talk about a human rights-based approach during these times. We need to look at community-based strategies, and here I'm subject to correction. I think we are far behind in terms of community strategies to reduce vulnerabilities. Again, from a country perspective, I think looking at our social compact, how do we deal with the loss of income, etc., are challenges we are going to face. Tackling unemployment, what does that mean? Helping our middle-aged and mature workers, what does that mean? The future of jobs, it begins now, it's already begun. And finally, keeping social mobility alive. One of the things I find now, of course, with varying degrees, is that depending on your social class, your mobility is also related to that in terms of its impact, whether you can actually go, not go, your lockdown, your access to information is 100% or less. Social mobility is key if you want to prevent dissension and other types of this social discontent in time to come. So I think we've got a bag full of issues to deal with looking forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jivan. Thank you for your insightful insights into the situation of Sri Lanka. And you have already highlighted that how this COVID-19 pandemic has been exacerbating the existing fragilities and inequalities. And how the remittances that were coming to Sri Lanka, how it has been reduced, and the people who were remitting this money from the Gulf countries or elsewhere, what kind of situation they have been facing while coming back. And it is also an interesting point that, working from home, it is a privilege of some people who are not into really in the manual work. They can afford to work from home. They have the privilege to do so. And also, what Jivan pointed out very correctly, the kind of experiences Sri Lanka have been going through, it has been going through, it is also primarily because of its nature as an island nation. Now, from an island nation, let us move on to a landlocked country of Nepal. So our next speaker would be Mr. Hari Sharma, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Social Dialogue and Social Science, BAHA, Kathmandu. He has served in the government and academia in various capacities over the last many years. He has taught at different academic institutions, including Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu, Kathmandu College of Management, and Kathmandu University. After graduating from Punjab University, Chandigarh, he obtained his master's degree in political science from Tribhuvan University. He was a Fulbright scholar at Cornell University, Ithaca, United States of America, where he obtained another master's degree in comparative politics. He is also the co-author of Political Leadership in Nepal and Local Leadership in Nepal. He has contributed extensively to books, journals, and newspapers. He is a political commentator regularly on news portals and as well as the television channels and newspapers published from Nepal and from abroad. And above all, I have been he has been one of my closest friends for the last 25 years when probably we met for the first time in 1995 in the United States. So now it's over to Hari.
Thank you, Sabya, for this little long but very nice introduction. I always consider Calcutta Research Group as my second home, so it's a pleasure to talk. I've been participating in the various webinars of Calcutta Research Group in this lockdown, also specifically on migrant workers, state, society, these kind of issues. I'm not an empirical social scientist in terms of looking at the numbers and things, but I definitely been observing the trends, what is happening, and how different institutions are reacting to the plights of migrant workers. While listening to Meghnaji and Jeevan and colleagues from Afghanistan, Nepal is no exception of the many experience that you have shared. In Nepal's case, migrant workers is always somebody who goes to overseas. Since we share open border with India, 1950 treaty, which treats both nationals at par. So whenever somebody says migrant workers, it's basically in a popular discussions and popular understanding. Migrant workers are those who travel to far aways, like Gulf or Malaysia or Japan, except India. But people who go to India are also migrant workers in a larger definition. So there's a little bit disjuncture. If you turn the Nepali newspaper, when they say migrant worker, they invariably look towards the people going to Gulf and Middle East, Korea, Japan, that sort of thing. So it's precisely because of the question of how do we regulate, manage the people who cross the border so easily, and in India also. Because of the India is also subcontinental country, very large of its own, but these invisible workers became visible because of the lockdown. Otherwise, there were some concepts in social science arena to deal with people leaving home, going away, something like a pravasi kamdar, apravasi kamdar, all kind of things. But suddenly it became so stark. And there was always a dilemma with the migrant study program in Nepal, how to deal with the workers who cross the border to go India, because they were seasonal, they were permanent, there were different categories of the workers who crossed the border to go India. It became obvious and very stark when people were returning home and there was a big crowd and jam in our border across the 500 or kilometer long border between India and Nepal. These people become suddenly visible, and what to do with these people? They were leaving job, and similar to the Indian experience, the Nepali migrant workers who were working in India, they also walked miles, hundreds of miles, with the children's bag, box, everything. So suddenly, Nepali policymakers, intelligentsia suddenly woke up that what is happening in India is happening to us. But the borders are very interesting point. It's a border separates who is who is not yours, who is to allow in, who is not to allow in. Borders are basically created on the notion of creating otherness. Similarly, the Indian workers who were working in Nepal also faced a similar situation, because both government didn't wanted to let their own citizens to get into it. So it was a very interesting time in terms of how we define them, who should take care of these people, because a pandemic didn't care about who is their citizen, who is not their citizen. Duty of care for the state was their citizen. So I think this is where the migrants face biggest security challenges in terms of their health and safety, because nobody was taking care. Even within the India, what I have been reading is that states were not taking care of the cities, the workers from other states. So there was a tension. Similarly, across the international border line, we could see the dilemma: what is the role and responsibilities of the state? State which is supposed to be imagined, or state which is supposed to saw itself as a custodian of the its subject, suddenly abdicating its role. The governments were fighting for the borderland, but when people came to border claiming that we wanted to enter our territory, our homeland, suddenly health was big issue. And I think because of this mismanagement in border, from both management perspectives and from the conceptual perspective, what happened at the border areas became the most infected area in the both sides of the border, India and Nepal border. So I wanted to bring in how border crossing And basically, open border crossing and the migrant worker issue is one of the theoretical challenges, how to deal with it. The another question that was came to my mind is that what is the duty of care for the state? Or in the pandemic, even if migrant is outsider in that particular territory or that particular community, because it's a pandemic, do we need to take care of migrant workers in terms of basic health security? And for the migrant workers from Nepal's perspective, those who went abroad, who flew in airplanes, sudden loss of work in the destination country, they were returning en bloc, en masse. And I think many people leave those destination country in haste. And what I'm seeing, observing these days is a question of wage theft. Many people have not been paid. Many people, there was a precarious contract system. And again, who is to care for migrant workers? What kind of contract, social contract that we need to look into? What kind of social dialogue, which is as a very liberal principle that ILO preaches, is violated all over. One hope was that in the wake of pandemic and possibly after slowing down the pandemic, there will be a possibility of new social contract between state, labor, and the employer. And because the state system is a very much of a welfare state-based argument or liberal state-based argument, there will be a contract between different interest groups. But suddenly what we're seeing is that the state, which has abdicated its role in protecting its own subject or its own citizens, can they enter into a new possible negotiation? And in that sense, Nepali state is economically very weak, dependent on a foreign aid or external assistance. How can it deal with its own worker? Its negotiating capacity with the destination countries are not there. Let alone the trade unions and international trade union movements. And I think what became stark in this pandemic is that the global trade union movement, both national and regional, I think they were not ready for this kind of thing. There was no such a discussions around this pandemic issue. It became kind of surprise to many of them. And I think again, another issue that I observe, which is a very important, is that the trade union movements or the workers movement in last 10 years or 20 years has been very much weakened. Weakened because the informalization of work. The contract system has been it was a new way of dealing with the workers at the individual level. It was through the hiring companies that the workers were contracted. So there was an erosion in the trade union rights and the movement because of the neoliberal economy, the shifting of the production sites, various international instruments. So in the wake of the pandemic, weak trade union arrangements or representational institutions were also weak. So they were not been able to put. And then the other issue that I see all over the region, including Nepal, is that states do not want to deal with the workers. Basically, look at the India, the 20 plus trade union rights or workers' rights are clubbed together into 4 categories. They are curbing trade union rights, and we all, authoritarian regimes and government all over the world learn from their peers. In Nepal also, we see the government trying to limit or to curtail the trade union rights or the workers' right. So there's a pandemic, abdication by the state, the unions not prepared. And I think, and then another thing is that, I don't know about other countries, in Nepal, the so-called NGO sector or civil society sector was basically not looking into the world of work. The workers were seen, because of the political history, workers were seen near to political parties. They were very much partisan in that sense. So-called independent civil society movement or foreign-funded NGOs saw trade unions as a pariah. So therefore, not many civil society groups and NGOs are working on the workers' question. So I think workers are abdicated by or left alone by all these actors and things. So the challenge for the migrant workers is informalization of work. Already informal workers and sector is already hit hard by the pandemic, and everybody is abdicating role. What kind of social solidarity would emerge? Who would speak for the worker is going to be a big issue. So this is very much a very generic observation from Nepal with the support to various empirical observation of the subcontinent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hari, for very important comments. And Hari has flagged off a number of issues, including open border crossing and the condition of the returning migrants, either from India or from other countries, say from Malaysia, from Gulf countries to Nepal. And most importantly, what Hari has pointed out, the weakening of the trade union movement due to the informalization of labor in the neoliberal times. So having listened to that, let us now move on to our last panelist, Dr. Noor Sanauddin, who has been teaching sociology and anthropology in the Department of Sociology, University of Peshawar, Pakistan, for the last 10 years. He has obtained his PhD degree from the School of Social and Political Sciences of the University of Glasgow, UK, with specialization in gender issues. He has published in many academic journals of international repute. He is also a founding member of the South Asian Network for Displacement and Development, SAND, a consortium of academics and development practitioners working on migration, refugees, and displacement in the context of conflict and climate change. Dr. Noor Sanauddin.
Thank you very much. Very good evening to all the participants of this forum and my fellow co-speakers. Today I'm going to talk more or less similarly as my other colleagues. Especially I would like to talk about the current situation of the pandemic in Pakistan, and then the link between COVID-19 and migrant workers. And lastly, I'll be talking about the role of government and civil society in responding to the pandemic. So first of all, right now there are 365,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, and the death rate is 7,000 people have so far died from the pandemic. The first case was detected in February 2020. Most of the important role in the spread of pandemic was played by two major groups. One, the religious gathering which took place in Lahore in March, which is called Tablighi Jamaat. So this religious group had a mega event in Lahore every year. That gathering was responsible for most of the cases in the country, and till April, it is believed that almost 37% of all the cases in the country can be traced back to this Lahore religious gathering. Another group which also played an important role in the spread of the disease in the country was pilgrimage coming from Iran as well as from Saudi Arabia during those days. So and third one is of course migrant labor coming from Gulf countries. Pakistan is already a very vulnerable country in terms of the vulnerable people living in Pakistan, including the IDPs, internally displaced people. 1.5 million people are currently displaced due to conflict and climate. And also Pakistan is home to a large number of Afghan refugees. They are living in camps. Most of them are daily wage earners. So they are the most vulnerable people, due to which we can visibly see the impact of COVID-19 on these kind of vulnerable people. Regarding the link between migrants and COVID-19, of course, migrants are the source of the spread of pandemic, but also at the same time they are also the most affected people. So there is a very close link between the two. Two kind of labor, as my colleagues pointed out. One is the internal migrants, another is the external migrants. Pakistan has 11 million migrant workers working outside Pakistan. 90% of these migrant workers are actually working in the Gulf countries. When the border was locked by Pakistani government, a lot of migrant workers, especially in the Gulf countries, were stranded. They were forced to remain inside their home without any job, and their families back home had to live without proper remittances, and they faced a lot of suffering. And then a number of migrants were also forcefully deported by the Gulf countries to Pakistan without properly testing them. And Pakistan also on the airport, they didn't have proper testing and isolating facilities, due to which it was very difficult for Pakistan to manage the returning migrants, which further exacerbated the spread of the corona disease inside the country. And also most of these migrants workers which were forcefully deported by Gulf countries, they were sent back without receiving proper compensation, withholding their pending wages, and without properly testing them or treating them. So this was also a greater crisis. Regarding the internal migrants, there are around 8 million people inside Pakistan who are working away from their home in different cities. And the sudden lockdown of the country, just like India, also forced most of these migrants workers to go back to their homes. And because the transport was not available in those days, so many had to travel by other means. For example, one famous case in Pakistan, which was, which became a joke, was that two people from Karachi came to Swat, which are polar opposite, by having a rickshaw. So they took 5 days by traveling through rickshaw from Karachi to Swat. So according to the Ministry of Planning, some 18.5 million people became jobless due to COVID-19, and also the daily wages, the daily wages actually dropped. Before the pandemic, a daily wage labor was earning 700 per day, but due to this joblessness, the daily wage came down to 500 per day. Now you can hire a worker for 500 per day, but before the pandemic, he used to earn 700 per day. So the 200 rupees gap per day is a loss to every labor families. So this has definitely going to have effect on the household expenditure and purchasing power of the poor people. Now, the government of Pakistan has some very good initiatives to tackle this pandemic, especially one program which is Ehsaas Emergency Cash Program. The Prime Minister announced Ehsaas Emergency Cash Program, in which 144 billion rupees were distributed among poor families. 12,000 poor families were benefited from this program, in which 12,000 rupees per family were distributed in these families. Also, some other packages too. For example, the health worker, there was a special package announced by the government of Pakistan for health workers. All those doctors and paramedics who died during pandemic were declared as martyred, and they were given cash compensation of 2.5 million per case. This was also a good initiative. Also, the government encouraged small and micro enterprises by training people into jobs like poultry, which were chicken were distributed among families so that they can raise chickens and eggs so that their food and nutrition are somehow compensated. But the most important thing in Pakistani context was the response of the civil society. It is a very well-known fact that in the Pakistani context, there is a very well-connected society. The social network or the social capital is very strong. So people help each other a lot. The philanthropist actually played a great role in easing the miseries of poor people by distributing food items on a very large scale. Civil society organizations, for example, NGOs, as well as other associations, for example, the Peshawar University, where I'm teaching, the Teacher Association, we call it Peshawar University Teacher Association. It also distributed 5,000 bags of rice and along with cooking oil into the poor families. These kind of examples are really encouraging in case of Pakistan. But one more thing, which is I don't know if this is also true in case of other South Asian countries, but in Pakistan it is being felt that the government of Pakistan is also using this pandemic for political purposes. So along with the livelihood problem or a health problem in Pakistan, this pandemic is also considered to be a political problem as well, a political issue as well. How? It is, for example, the Ehsaas emergency cash program, the 12,000 rupees which were being distributed and among 2 or 3 people, they were to be identified by political workers of the ruling party, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. So the Imran Khan government also established a task force, not a task force, but they call it emergency response force, which was comprised of the activists of the ruling party. So those activists on street level, they collected the data of the poor people, and they actually were the main people to make somebody eligible for the receipt of the food and non-food item at the 12,000 rupees, etc. Secondly, the Ehsaas cash program was initiated by the government of Imran Khan to replace the already existing cash program started by Benazir government. So this was also politicized. In a sense, the Benazir income support program was replaced with Ehsaas cash program by the Imran Khan government. This is also, some people object that this is the changing of the name. Otherwise, the program was already going on. Another important thing which is being noted in Pakistan is that the government is also using this COVID-19 to suppress the dissident voices in the country. It is whenever there are rallies of opposition or gathering of oppositions, that the government says, okay, there is a pandemic, there should be lockdown, cities are being locked down. So some people say it is the pandemic is being used as a tool to suppress opposition voices and to take the liberty of people. So in conclusion, this in Pakistan, at least, this pandemic is also a political issue along with livelihood and health issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noor Sanauddin. And I think several points have been highlighted by all the panelists. First of all, I think that what is becoming clear that this pandemic is reconfiguring the borders, both interstate borders, international borders, and internal borders. Second is that the way the migrants has been stigmatized all over South Asia, basically, the returning migrants, coming back to their native villages, coming back to their own country. It's like blaming the pain for a nasty later. Third is that what we also witnessed probably in all the South Asian countries, more or less, that there has been advisories for staying home, even for the homeless people. And I don't know, I would pose this question before all the panelists, that in India, we have noticed in the recent times that politics has been judicialized recently in India. What has been the case in other countries of South Asia? And it is, I mean, this kind of stigmatization that all of you have been pointing out. It is more, difficult. I would say, fiendishly difficult in an age of racial animus. I mean, different kind of animosity is there already, existing fragilities and inequalities that was being pointed out by Jivan. And therefore, we find that, there has been a new kind of, a new process of dehumanization of particularly the unskilled and semi-skilled labor who have been contributing to the economies of these countries of South Asia in different ways. And we also need to look at the dynamics of exit from the welfare mechanisms that we had, in spite of the strengthening of the state during the times of Corona. And in fact, under such circumstances, the migrant labor, we are living with some kind of temporary futures with permanent constraints or newer constraints. So having said that, we have a couple of questions. Very briefly, I just put it before the panelists. One is that when there has been, reports of escalating cases of gendered violence against women, especially in their homes, owing to the impact of the COVID-19 and the fact that the traditional state-managed service delivery mechanisms have been severely impacted. And also keeping in mind that such services are not easily accessible to migrant or refugee women in any case. How have health and legal support for cases of gendered violence in migrant communities been responded to during this pandemic? And when services are rarely available to citizens, where does the refugee or migrant woman find herself? So these are a couple of questions that are important, and it's for all the panelists. And in fact, this also brings us to another question. I mean, is this pandemic also pushing the frontiers of citizenship in South Asia? It's over to you once again. Anyone can respond. Yes, Hari, please go ahead.
I think it's a very interesting question. When we look into the work, the informalization of work is also feminization of work. So naturally, the odds are against the women because of the pandemic also, because they stay at home, they need to take care of their children, the work. So already toll is there. And then we, in Nepal also, we see much rise in the domestic violence. So there has been reports, plus the women's groups are advocating with the government, but being the very hard situations of reporting, reaching out to the community because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, there is a very big toll in the mental health conditions of very many working class families. And I see the violence against women both as the long-term structural neoliberal phenomena because of the informalization of work, which pandemic has exacerbated in a fullest extent, and response from civic societies or state, because their inability to freely move house to house, record things, has become quite difficult. Using technology to track through the telephone or conversation is new thing, because reach of technology to these poorest communities and household are still difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Hari. I think Meghnadi was going to say something. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, you've raised important questions. Where you talked about, is politics being judicialized? Well, at least you have a judiciary to go to, but we don't. Our judiciary, with the neoliberal state, the traditional institutions of judiciary, of administration, they have been eroding for a long time, and therefore, yes, there is a tendency that because of the lack of protest, we do tend to go to the court, but there is always that going to the court itself is not helpful. That has been established. In fact, my friend Barrister Sarah Hussain will speak tomorrow as a discussant. She will tell you that every time she makes a case in the High Court, she asks us to go out on the street or to write op-eds about it, or else it doesn't move. The case does not move. So you need that political pressure. And I think what Hari said is true also in every other country, that and Bangladesh especially, having a very vibrant civil society with talking about civic rights and everything, but used to go out on the street very often. But that has been, the spaces have been encroaching anyway. And with COVID, there is a physical problem. But we have found that that despite everything, violence against women have not, and it's not only domestic violence I'm talking about, as a result of the erosion of institutions, state institutions, and also the kind of crony capitalism that is growing up in our countries is creating these sort of party-based or, what shall I say, para-party kind of liaison politics, or you could say, in our words, we say bahinis. Bahinis are sort of strongmen who derive their power, either it's from party or from local MPs or from state level actors, wherever, or through property and private capital. These are the new agents are now coming as the new kind of perpetrators of violence of all kinds, especially gender violence. Recently, we've had this case of in Begumganj, Noakhali, where a woman was sexually molested, and the whole molestation scene was in the social media, and it immediately brought kind of really outroar among even in COVID times. There was a midnight sit-in in front of the parliament by women activists. And so these are, again, in time to time, we have seen that in crisis times, violence against women has increased and also received visibility. Because of the violence, because of the outrageousness of the violence, it has also received visibility in papers, in different activities. And so it's an interesting juncture where, and very interestingly, again, how is it related to migrant labor? The woman who was sexually attacked by these perpetrators, she belonged to a migrant family. I mean, a migrant family meaning her husband had been working abroad, on and off, sometimes at home, sometimes abroad. But then and we hear a lot of domestic violence increasing in such households, where the male guardian have left the women, and a lot of these extraneous kind of agents of politics and in want of better words, these bahinis, they have been getting access. And another thing is the business that they are involved in are illegal businesses like trafficking, like smuggling, like trafficking of drugs, body parts, whatever, of even people. They are using women. And just as we know that in the women peace conflict situation, conflict areas, rape is used as a tool of war crimes. You know, it is the same here, that here it is not war, but in this whole racketeering kind of activity, women's are vulnerable people whose sexuality is being sort of used in the trade itself. So this woman was actually told by this Bahini that that if you listen to us, we will not show this film on social media. But for them, what were they asking her to do was to get involved in the illegal, I think it was the, what do you call it, drug, it's not drugs, but it was modern babsha, I mean alcohol smuggling. So this is, and in the similar, I've been hearing these stories also in Cox's Bazar area, which is a border area, which is refugee receiving area, and refugee who hosts refugees. There too, both refugee women as well as resident women of that host area have been time and again been abducted by these people and raped, and then they were told that, oh, so now you see, you do not retain the dignity of a woman now, no one will accept you, so you'd better be involved in this trafficking business that we are doing, or in sex tourism, or in other things. So these are the and they are real life stories of the women there. And so you see the system, as I said, the structure which perpetrates these kind of stereotypes about women, and is being used by this kind of trafficking and this kind of crony capitalist activities that is taking place. And because of the absence of the law and order situation, because the police can't go right into the scene, because of other mobilities, the absence of surveillance. It was mentioned, refugee was mentioned, we have been working with refugees. And of course, we have seen that in terms of refugees. Now in refugee, at least there was some critical services given. So the refugees on the one hand did not have to face the difficulties in access to food or shelter. But critical services like sanitation, food, shelter, this was allowed. But violence against women was not considered to be a critical service. So when such cases did come about in the camps, they were being arbitrated by their own leadership, which is the Maji system that has grown out of the UN agencies. So, but there was no oversight, because the NGOs, who were looking after the protection of refugees in terms of protection of women against the violence, I mean, they weren't able to have an oversight of these arbitration processes. So finally, when the camps were opened up to protection services, violence against women was then included in it. So it took a lot of lobbying and advocacy on the part of many people to do that. So it's a very difficult situation for women, and we've seen that even in rural areas, women have been subject, if not even when NGOs were working, they on unpaid work and women earning. So the extra earning and the income of the men were stopped, and women also stopped bringing in cash. Many people starved, and once you are in deprivation and poverty, the brunt is taken by the women themselves. So in this sense, I will stop here. I think I've addressed most of the topics that have been raised.
We are really running short of time, and before we conclude this session, one last question. I would request three panelists to say just one line, if you can. I mean, the question is basically, or two questions. One is that has there been any experience of strategies of solidarities with migrants in cities? And that is a question to all the speakers, all the panelists, but basically to Noor Sanauddin and Jivan and Reza Husseini, who have not spoken recently. And another question is that what role is being played by the civil society organizations in terms of policy advocacy with regard to addressing the rights of the migrant workers, particularly the women migrant workers. So let me go in the reverse order. So let me just request first Dr. Noor Sanauddin to comment very briefly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll start from the last, which women's, your question about women's migrant worker. I don't know if you people would agree with me or not, but in Pakistani context, we have very few women migrant worker. Basically, it is like, it is not an issue which is in the public eye so far, because in the Gulf countries, for example, 90% of our migrant workers are working in the Gulf countries, but very few of them are women. Very few, I would say. I personally do not know even a single woman who is working in the Gulf countries as a migrant worker. Their husbands are working, but not women, right? Internal migrant worker, again, they are mostly men. Men go to other cities like Karachi. Women are also sometimes go with them, sometimes they stay home, but they are not mostly, women are not migrating to work in other cities. Therefore, it is not a debate here. Secondly, you talked about solidarity with migrant workers or the policy, civil societies. So far, UN agencies like UN OCHA, for example, I know, and other UN agencies, I don't know exactly the names, but I was reading something actually. A document was prepared by a UN agency in the Pakistani context, in which it was recommended for the government, to the government of Pakistan, that special policies of how to reintegrate those migrant workers who are coming from the Gulf countries, how to reintegrate them better into society, economically especially, as well as to retrain them, to reskill them, to connect them with the employer here inside the country. Right? This kind of document was prepared by a UN agency for the consideration of the government of Pakistan. So that's the only thing I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Jivan?
Yeah, hi. Responding to both your questions about solidarity and advocacy, I think I pick up from where your colleague from Nepal left off. To be fair by everybody, I think the whole country is in a state of shock in terms of trying to deal with the impact of this virus. And solidarity, regrettably not, because I think the outsider is seen as the outsiders. The migrant worker is seen as an outsider. I speak about the internal migrant, which is absolutely tragic to say the least. And in terms of advocacy, little or nothing is said. Here again, these are lessons for all of us. I think we talk about responses in emergencies, and I think there's a lot to be said in terms of the response during this particular emergency. Did we really respond? I really don't think so. I really don't think so for a variety of reasons. A part of it could well be that the reality of this virus is that you do get locked down. You just get locked up, literally, de facto. And it, I think,
some problem with Jivan's connection, unfortunately. So, Mr. Reza Husseini, would you like to say anything? The last word?
Yeah, I just want to add a few words. I agree with what all colleagues said about the gender and I think most of the topics is very similar between the Asian country. One point about the Afghans, migrants worker in Iran, and you touched the topic of nationalism and COVID-19, which, the nationalism is somehow included some people and sometimes exclude some people. In the case of, yeah, I see the Jivan is back, so I don't know, should I continue or give?
Yeah, you continue. I will request Jivan afterwards. Yes.
Okay, so in the case of nationalism and COVID-19, the question in Iran with regard to Afghan migrants worker was that who is entitled for the medical services, and the Iranian government is going to show that you are my citizens, and the Afghan migrants is the others, and we are not responsible for protecting them. That we all talk about the globalization and other things, but when it comes to the responsibility to the other people, to the migrants, to the vulnerable people, no one is going to talk about this responsibility. And the other issue is the visibility and invisibility, or citizenship and non-citizenship. I mean, in the normal situations, the migrant workers are invisible, and they are not at the policies. They are not at the anything that is positive. But when it's coming to the crisis, they become visible, but not at a positive way, mostly as a source of problems. Which happened exactly with Afghans in Iran and returnees, which the time they came back to Afghanistan or returns to Afghanistan. In terms of the civil society and the advocacy, I just want to say one point, which is that most of the civil societies in Afghanistan depend on the fund. And the fund is coming mostly from the wealthy countries like the EU countries. So right now, the policy of the EU countries is that to put pressure on Afghan governments to not letting the Afghan citizens cross the border to come to Europe. So they're not going to give funds for Afghan civil society to advocates. And since they are also very fan dependent, I can say there is very, very few organizations who advocate for the right of refugee and migrants workers, which is a pity for the Afghan civil society. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jivan, we lost you for a while. Can you comment? And you will have the last minute.
No, quite frankly, I didn't have much more to add, apart from saying that we have not responded adequately. We are in a state of crisis, and I think that's a reflection for all of us. For the first time, we have a pandemic as a crisis. And how have we responded? I think a lot can be said. You all said a lot in the publication that Ranavir brought out in terms of how the state responded to your own people. Here too, we need to reflect a lot. I would say that I'm being kind here.
Thank you, Jivan. So we are in a crisis, and migrant labor, as we see them, I mean, they are in a condition of precarity and unfreedom. And with those words, what we find from the experiences from almost all the South Asian countries from this panel, with those words, we conclude this session, and wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you very much. And if you have any announcement, Utsha, from the desk.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you, sir. We also thanks Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung and IWM Vienna for collaborating with us, and without whom this workshop wouldn't have been possible. And to all the workshop and conference participants, please come down to the venue. We have a movie session from 4 p.m. We will show 2 movies. So please come down, and then we will have a good movie session and a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.